coming live from the Tivoli Met Radio studio here on our area campus. This is All Sports with Gerardo. Thank you for listening to All Sports through Met Radio on mymetmedia.com, live every Thursday from 3:30 to 5 p.m. This is your host, Gerardo, and all I talk is sports. On the show today, I am going to talk about NFL football, Major League Baseball, NBA basketball, NHL hockey, college football, and college basketball. Before I start the show, I hope you all had a great week. To start off with Major League Baseball, pitcher Steve Cishek and the White Sox have agreed to a one-year contract. Pitcher Jimmy Nelson and the Dodgers have agreed to a one-year contract. Pitcher Michael Fulmer and the Tigers have agreed to a one-year contract. The Rockies signed Chris Owings to a minor league contract. The Rockies signed infielder Kelby Tomlinson to a minor league contract. The Rockies signed catcher Elias Diaz to a minor league contract. There is a possibility that Nolan Arenado gets traded from the Rockies this offseason. So if we take a look at Nolan Arenado and the Rockies, there is a 50-50 chance of him being traded. All these trade rumors, which involves Nolan Arenado, have started since this offseason, going back to the Major League Baseball winter meetings. These Nolan Arenado trade talks have been in place up until this day. Now, I don't know if they're going to trade Nolan Arenado or not. The Rockies keep saying they're not going to trade him and that he's a franchise player they want to build their team around in 2020 and going into the future. And the Rockies definitely want to bounce back into the postseason in 2020 after missing the postseason in 2019 when they went to the postseason back-to-back seasons in 2017 and 2018. Now the Rockies know if they want to get into the postseason in 2020, Nolan Arenado is going to be one of the main factors. But if they trade him, who knows what type of season the Rockies would have in 2020 or if they would even make it into the postseason. But the Rockies definitely want to have a better season in 2020 and they want to make it into the postseason. Now, if Nolan Arenado got traded, here are a few possible teams that would likely trade for Nolan Arenado. This includes the Braves, the White Sox, the Rangers, the Nationals, the Phillies, the Cubs, the Blue Jays, and the Dodgers. Now, if the Rockies are willing to trade Nolan Arenado, they definitely want something great in return. They don't want this trade to be like the Ubaldo Jimenez or the Troy Tulowitzki trade, where they get prospects back in return. You only see them once and you never hear of them ever again. Now, if the Rockies trade Nolan Arenado, any of these teams that are willing to trade for Nolan Arenado, or whatever team it would be, would have to offer something great in return, whether it's their top prospects or a current player on their roster. Now, if the Rockies do trade Nolan Arenado, here would be the best teams to trade Nolan Arenado to. The Braves. The Braves have one of the best farm systems in Major League Baseball. They have a lot of top prospects, so the Braves would definitely have the opportunity of giving some of their great prospects in return for Nolan Arenado. Also, the Braves are willing to get back into the postseason in 2020, so the Braves definitely want to make their team better by adding Nolan Arenado. And if they do that, there's no doubt the Braves would make it back into the postseason, but they would also be a World Series contender. With everything the White Sox have been doing this offseason by re-signing players and by signing new players onto the team, the White Sox would be another candidate to sign Nolan Arenado. They also got some top prospects that they can give in return. Whether the White Sox get Nolan Arenado or they don't, the White Sox have a great chance at making the postseason in 2020. But if they were to add Nolan Arenado, the White Sox would be a serious World Series contender in the American League. The Rangers is another team that wants to trade for Nolan Arenado. They would also have the prospects that they can send in return for Nolan Arenado. The Nationals just won the World Series in 2019, which was last season. So by adding Nolan Arenado and having an upgrade at third base, there's no doubt that the Nationals would be a World Series contender in 2020, which they already are since they just won the World Series in 2019. But by adding Nolan Arenado, this would make the Nationals even better, and very likely they would go back and win the World Series in 2020. The Phillies want to make their team better, and by adding Nolan Arenado, this would increase their chance of making it into the postseason this season, but also making it to where they want to go in 2020 or going into the future. The Phillies definitely want to win the World Series and reach the World Series, whether it's in 2020 or going into the future. And by adding the last missing piece onto that Phillies roster, that would give the Phillies a greater chance at making it into the postseason, reaching the World Series, and winning the World Series. There's no doubt that Nolan Arenado would be a big upgrade at third base for the Phillies, and if they were to add him with Bryce Harper and the rest of that Phillies team, there's no doubt they would be a World Series contender. The Cubs is another team that could possibly trade for Nolan Arenado. By adding Nolan Arenado, this would definitely be a big upgrade at third base for the Cubs. But also, the Cubs have made it into the playoffs in the last few years, and they've also won the World Series back in 2016. After missing the playoffs last season, the Cubs definitely want to make it back into the playoffs in 2020 and going into the future. And by having Nolan Arenado on the Cubs, this would give the Cubs a greater chance at making it into the playoffs in 2020 and going into the future. And if the Cubs want to win another World Series, adding Nolan Arenado to the roster would give them a greater chance at bringing another World Series title back to Chicago. Also, the Cubs would have the prospects, and they would also have the other players that they could trade in return to the Rockies for Nolan Arenado. The Blue Jays would be another team that could possibly trade for Nolan Arenado. There's no doubt by adding Nolan Arenado to the Blue Jays, this would be a big upgrade at third base, and they could definitely use another great bat in their starting lineup, and the Blue Jays could definitely use a good third baseman. And finally, the Dodgers would be a great team for Nolan Arenado to go to. Nolan Arenado is from the Los Angeles area. He grew up as a Dodgers fan. It's very likely that the Rockies would not trade Nolan Arenado to the Dodgers, since the Dodgers are in the same division. They're in the National League West, and the Rockies would not want to trade their star player to the Dodgers, since the Dodgers are in the same division and they have this divisional rival against the Dodgers, especially that the Dodgers have made it into the postseason for consecutive seasons, and they've been the best team and the team to beat in the National League West. So the Rockies would not want to make the Dodgers even better by adding Nolan Arenado. But the Dodgers would be the one team that would want Nolan Arenado, since he's from the Los Angeles area, and there's no doubt he would be a big upgrade at third base for the Dodgers, even though the Dodgers have Justin Turner. So those are the possible teams that would likely trade for Nolan Arenado. The best teams that could possibly trade for Nolan Arenado, and the teams that could likely add Nolan Arenado to their roster, would be the Braves, the White Sox, the Rangers, or the Nationals. So we're going to have to wait and see what happens. going into the next few weeks, it's a 50-50 chance that Nolan Arenado could be traded this offseason. We're going to have to wait and see if the Rockies do trade Nolan Arenado. If they do, they're definitely going to want to have something great in return. They're going to want the other team's top prospects or current players on their roster that are great players, and the Rockies definitely don't want to have a trade like they did with Ubaldo Jimenez and Troy Tulowitzki. There's no doubt that Nolan Arenado is one of the best players to ever play on the Rockies. He's one of the best third basemen to ever play for the Rockies, but he's also one of the best third basemen in Major League Baseball right now. And he's been one of the best third basemen that Major League Baseball has ever seen. So if the Rockies are willing to trade Nolan Arenado, they're just not going to give him away for nothing. They're going to want something great in return, and it's going to have to be some top prospects. But there is a great chance that the Rockies will hold on to Nolan Arenado because they definitely want to build around him. Nolan Arenado is a franchise player. He's a once-in-a-generation player. There's not that many Nolan Arenados out there, and they definitely don't pop up that often, so the Rockies definitely just don't want him to walk away or give him up for nothing. But there is a great chance that Nolan Arenado will be on the 2020 Rockies roster, and we're just going to have to wait and see what happens in the next few weeks for the rest of the off season. Right now, I'm going to take a commercial break. When I come back, I will talk about the NFL. Welcome back to All Sports with Gerardo. Moving on now to NFL football. The Cowboys fired head coach Jason Garrett. Mike McCarthy will become the Cowboys' next head coach. Matt LaCue will become the Panthers' next head coach. Joe Judge will become the Giants' next head coach. The Rams are moving on from defensive coordinator Wade Phillips. The 2019 passing title belongs to Jameis Winston. The 2019 receiving title belongs to Michael Thomas. The 2019 rushing title belongs to Derrick Henry. The 2019 sack title belongs to Shaquille Barrett. At 23 years old, Lamar Jackson won the Heisman in college. He was an ACC Player of the Year 2 times in college. He was the only player to throw for 3,000 yards and rush for 1,000 yards for consecutive years in college. He is the NFL's touchdown leader this season. He broke the NFL quarterback single-season rushing yards record. He was selected to the Pro Bowl. He was named first-team All-Pro. He is the youngest quarterback with a perfect passer rating in the NFL, and he is the youngest quarterback with a playoff start in the NFL. 649 players have rushed for 1,000 yards in a season. 124 players have thrown 30 touchdowns in a season, and Lamar Jackson is the first player in NFL history with both in a season. Larry Fitzgerald has led the Cardinals in receiving yards at age 21, 22, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 32, 33, 34, 35, and 36 years old. So right now I'm going to give you a recap of the 2019 Broncos season. The Broncos started the season 0-4, and they finished the season 7-9 with quarterback Drew Lock. Now if we take a look at the Broncos, throughout their season, they switched between 3 different quarterbacks. For most of the first half of the regular season, Joe Flacco was the starting quarterback for the Broncos. After the Broncos traded for Joe Flacco from the Ravens the previous offseason. So Joe Flacco was the quarterback for the Broncos, but then he got injured during that Broncos-Colts game. So then Brendan Allen had to come in in backup Joe Flacco since Joe Flacco got injured, and then he was placed on injured reserve for the rest of the season since he was injured. Brendan Allen stepped up and he was the quarterback for 3 games. Brendan Allen didn't play that bad when he was the starting quarterback for the Broncos. He was able to win some games for the Broncos. And then for most of the season, Drew Lock was on injured reserve after injuring his thumb back in the preseason. But after the Broncos bye week, Drew Lock came off of injured reserve, and the Broncos gave an opportunity to Drew Lock, and they let Drew Lock start for the Broncos for the rest of the season, which included all 5 regular season games in December. When Drew Lock came in for the Broncos at the quarterback position, he definitely turned the season around for the Broncos. And in those 5 games throughout the month of December, Drew Lock was able to go 4-1. Drew Lock definitely turned this Broncos season around after the Broncos started 0-4, and the Broncos were able to finish the season 4-1. The Broncos ended up finishing the season 7-9 and just falling short of 1 game of finishing 8-8 and having a 500 season. But there's no doubt that the Broncos had a better season this season compared to the previous seasons, even though they missed the playoffs. Now, from the time that Joe Flacco was the starting quarterback to Brandon Allen and to Drew Lock, there was definitely a big difference from Joe Flacco to Drew Lock. Joe Flacco was a great starting quarterback when he was the starting quarterback for the Ravens, but when Joe Flacco came here to the Broncos, it definitely wasn't the same, and it definitely wasn't the Joe Flacco we've seen with the Ravens. When Drew Lock came in, he definitely changed the Broncos offense, and he just brought something different to the Broncos team, especially on offense. Drew Lock definitely brought a different energy compared to Joe Flacco, and that's one of the reasons why Drew Lock was able to turn the season around in the final games of the regular season after he started all 5 games in December, which ended up being the final 5 games of the 2019 season for the Broncos. There's no doubt that the Broncos were disappointing again this season, especially for the first half of the 2019 season. But the way they turned the season around, especially after the bye week and in the month of December, there's no doubt that the Broncos have a bright future ahead of them, especially with their young, talented players on offense and defense, but especially on offense, with Drew Lock, Courtland Sutton, Noah Fant, Phillip Lindsay. That Broncos offense looks like it's going to be great in 2020 and going into the future. After the Broncos fell short of a 500 season, finishing the season 7-9, and missing the playoffs for another consecutive season, with the way the Broncos started the season, but especially the way the Broncos finished the season, 2020 and going into the future looks bright for the Broncos. And the Broncos are definitely looking forward to the 2020 season and turning 2020 into a winning season and getting back into the playoffs after missing the playoffs for the last few seasons. And with the way that the Broncos finished off the 2019 season going 4-1, and with the way Drew Lock played at the quarterback position, the future looks bright for Drew Lock and the Broncos, but especially that Broncos offense with the young talented players and that Broncos defense. And we're going to have to wait and see how the Broncos play in 2020 and how they improve the team this offseason to have a winning season in 2020 and to make it into the playoffs in 2020. Now, if we take a look at the Broncos' schedule, the Broncos definitely could have finished the season with a better record, especially at the beginning of the season when they were losing games that they should have won. Now, if we take a look at the 2019 schedule for the Broncos, they start off with Week 1. They went against the Raiders. This was a game that they could have won or lost. They ended up losing this game. In Week 2, the Broncos went against the Bears, and they lost a close game to the Bears right at the end of the game by a field goal. This was a game the Broncos should have won. In Week 3, the Broncos went against the Packers. This was a game the Broncos were not going to win since they had to play the Packers in Green Bay. In Week 4, the Broncos went against the Jaguars. This was a game that the Broncos should have won. They ended up losing another close game right at the end of the game by a field goal. In Week 5, the Broncos went against the Chargers, and they won this game. In Week 6, the Broncos went against the Titans, and they won this game. In Week 7, the Broncos went against the Chiefs, and they lost this game. I was expecting the Broncos to not win against the Chiefs here in Denver and in Kansas City. So I was expecting the Broncos to lose both games to the Chiefs. In Week 8, the Broncos went against the Colts. This was another game the Broncos should have won. They lost this game right at the end by a field goal. Another game that they lost only by a few points. In Week 9, the Broncos went against the Browns, and the Broncos won this game. Week 10 was their bye week. In Week 11, the Broncos went against the Vikings. This was a game that the Broncos should have won, especially having the lead that they did, and they ended up blowing that lead in the second half of the game, so the Broncos lost that game. In Week 12, the Broncos went against the Bills. This was a game I wasn't expecting the Broncos to win since it was up in Buffalo. In Week 13, the Broncos went against the Chargers, and they won this game. In Week 14, the Broncos went against the Texans, and they won that game. In Week 15, the Broncos went against the Chiefs, and they lost that game. In Week 16, the Broncos went against the Lions, and they won that game. And in Week 17, the Broncos went against the Raiders, and they won that game. So if we take a look at this Broncos schedule, every year that the schedule comes out, you see who the Broncos or the other 31 teams are playing, and there's definitely games that you circle since they're going to be the big games. But there's also games that you look at and see the Broncos or the other 131 NFL teams are not going to win that game since it's a big game, and because they're playing a certain team, it's very likely they're not going to win that game. So after the Broncos schedule came out, and I saw who they were playing here in Denver on the road, there was definitely a few games that I had circled that the Broncos were not going to win just because of who they were playing. And there was other games I had circled for games that they could possibly win or lose. And if they were to win this game, it would be a close game. And then there was definitely games that I circled that they could possibly win and games that they should win. So if we take a look at this Broncos schedule, the games that they lost by 7 or fewer points or by a field goal, those were games they should have won. If the Broncos were to beat the Bears, the Jaguars, the Colts, and the Vikings, it's very likely the Broncos would have finished the season 11-5. Even if they didn't win that Vikings game, the Broncos could have went 10-6. Whether they had Joe Flacco, Brendan Allen, or Drew Lock starting at the quarterback position, they just lost those games by a field goal. And if the Broncos would have won those games, it would have been very likely we could see the Broncos playing in the playoffs right now. And they could have went as a wild card team. They could have even had a chance at winning the AFC West. We'll never know if the Broncos would have made the playoffs because they lost these close games. But what we do know is what the Broncos need to do this offseason to make their team better for 2020. So if we take a look at the Broncos roster, here are some players to keep an eye on this offseason and going into the 2020 season. Drew Lock had a great season in 2019 after he started the final 5 regular season games. He went 4-1. So Drew Lock looks like he's going to be the Broncos franchise quarterback in 2020 and going into the future. Joe Flacco started the first half of the Broncos season, but when he got injured and got placed on injured reserve for the rest of the season with an injury, it's very likely that Joe Flacco is one and done after the type of season that he had in 2019 with the Broncos and getting injured. So I wouldn't expect to see Joe Flacco on the Broncos roster in 2020. Phillip Lindsay had another great season. He got another 1,000-yard rushing season. It's only his second season in the NFL, and he's already had back-to-back 1,000-yard rushing seasons. Also, Phillip Lindsay is due for a new contract, so we're going to have to wait and see what type of contract Phillip Lindsay gets from the Broncos this offseason. Courtland Sutton had another great season for the Broncos at the wide receiver position. Courtland Sutton got over 1,000 yards this season. And there's no doubt that Courtland Sutton is the Broncos' #1 wide receiver going into the future after the type of season he had in 2019. Chris Harris had a great season for the Broncos, but with his contract expiring at the end of this season, it's very likely that the Broncos will not re-sign Chris Harris with the type of money that he wants. The Broncos offered Chris Harris a contract extension at the trade deadline, but he declined the contract extension. So Chris Harris will hit free agency, and it's very likely Chris Harris will not be in a Broncos uniform in 2020. Alexander Johnson was definitely one of the best defensive players on the Broncos roster, and he was one of the best defensive players on that Broncos defense. Alexander Johnson came out of nowhere, and he stood out on that Broncos defense during the 2019 season, and he definitely had a great season on that Broncos defense. So I can't wait to see what Alexander Johnson can do in 2020 and going into the future. Bradley Chubb had a great season for the Broncos up until he tore his ACL, and he is out for the rest of the season. Now we're going to have to wait and see when Bradley Chubb returns from that ACL injury, but Bradley Chubb definitely wants to be back for the beginning of the 2020 season for the Broncos. Now looking at Garrett Bowles did not have a great season in 2019 for the Broncos. And if we take a look at Garrett Bowles with the type of season that he had, the Broncos need to do something with Garrett Bowles this offseason. They need to move him to a different position on the offensive line, or they need to cut Garrett Bowles. Because where Garrett Bowles plays on this offensive line is not a great spot for him. And after the type of season that Garrett Bowles had, and even the type of seasons he's had in the last few years for the Broncos, it looks like Garrett Bowles was a first-round bust. So this offseason, the Broncos need to move Garrett Bowles to a different position on the offensive line, or they need to cut him. Now looking at Justin Simmons was one of the best defensive players on the Broncos roster. Justin Simmons definitely had a great season for the Broncos. He was one of the breakout players and one of the best players on the Broncos defense. With Justin Simmons' contract expiring at the end of this season, the Broncos' #1 priority is to re-sign Justin Simmons to a new contract this offseason, because Justin Simmons was a great safety for the Broncos, and the Broncos definitely don't want to lose Justin Simmons in free agency. So Justin Simmons will be their #1 priority this offseason by signing him to a new contract. Noah Fant had a great season for the Broncos. He was a great tight end for the Broncos. So with the type of season that Noah Fant had for the Broncos this season, they're hoping that they finally found their tight end and that Noah Fant will be a great tight end for him going into 2020 and going into the future. Derek Wolfe had a great season for the Broncos this season. He was also one of the best defensive players for the Broncos this season under Vic Fangio's defensive mind. And there's no doubt that Derek Wolfe has always been a great defensive player on the Broncos, but especially this season. He had a breakout season with the Broncos, but unfortunately his season ended early with a season-ending injury. But with his contract expiring at the end of this season, hopefully the Broncos can re-sign Derek Wolfe, and if they can re-sign him at a right price, Derek Wolfe will be back on the Broncos roster in 2020 and going into the future. And we're just going to have to wait and see if Derek Wolfe and the Broncos can negotiate the right type of contract. Because there's no doubt that Derek Wolfe wants to play his entire career with the Broncos going into the future, and he definitely wants to retire with the Broncos. This offseason, the Broncos need to cut Devontae Booker. I don't know why he's still on the Broncos roster. The Broncos have running backs. They got Phillip Lindsay, Royce Freeman, Theo Riddick. They don't need Devontae Booker. The only reason why I think they have Devontae Booker on their roster is because he's a good blocker. Otherwise, they would have cut him last season or the previous season. But this season, the Broncos need to cut Devontae Booker. They don't need Devontae Booker as a running back or on their roster. Shelby Harris had another great season for the Broncos this season on defense, just like he did the previous season. But with Shelby Harris's contract expiring after this season, the Broncos are going to have to think about re-signing Shelby Harris. And if they can't re-sign him at the right price, Shelby Harris will hit free agency. Will Parks' contract expired at the end of this season, and the Broncos are going to have to think about re-signing Will Parks, and if it's at the right price, they will sign Will Parks to a new contract. Now, taking a look at the Broncos, here are the Broncos' off-season needs and what they need to do to improve the team for 2020. Get a quarterback, not a replacement quarterback for Drew Lock. They definitely need a backup quarterback, and they're just going to have to see who's available in free agency. But this will be the first time in the last few seasons the Broncos will not be looking for a quarterback in free agency or through the draft to be their starting quarterback. The Broncos look like they finally found a starting quarterback, which will be Drew Lock in 2020 and going into the future. But the Broncos definitely need a backup quarterback for Drew Lock. They need a running back. They need another running back to replace Devontae Booker or Theo Riddick that can run the football. The Broncos need a wide receiver that can be their second wide receiver. The Broncos have Deshaun Hamilton and Tim Patrick, but can they be the second wide receiver? Who knows? We're going to have to wait and see. But it's very likely that the Broncos will get their second wide receiver in free agency or through the draft. If the Broncos want to be better on offense and defense, they're definitely going to have to improve their offensive line and their defensive line. On the defensive line, the Broncos are going to have to think about re-signing Derek Wolfe and Shelby Harris. And if they don't, they're definitely going to have to find replacements for both of them or for one of them if they only sign one of them to a new contract or they don't sign one of them to a new contract. Either way, the Broncos are going to definitely have to improve their defensive line. If it includes Derek Wolfe and Shelby Harris, or it only includes Derek Wolfe or Shelby Harris, or it doesn't include Derek Wolfe or Shelby Harris. The Broncos are going to need cornerbacks. They're definitely going to need someone to replace Chris Harris if Chris Harris tests free agency and he gets signed to a new team and the Broncos don't bring back Chris Harris. The Broncos definitely need a number one cornerback. They need a great cornerback to replace Chris Harris. But the Broncos likely need two great cornerbacks on both sides of the defense. And the Broncos need someone that can replace their current punter. So the Broncos will definitely take a look and see if they can find a better punter. This offseason, the Broncos need to use their available salary cap money to sign current or new players onto the roster. They need to have another great draft class with all their draft picks and sign Justin Simmons and Derek Wolfe to a new contract. If the Broncos address all their offseason needs this offseason on offense and defense, it's very likely the Broncos will have a great team in 2020 and going into the future. Are the Broncos playoff bound in 2020? Will the Broncos have a better record in 2020? We will have to wait and see, but they need to improve the team this offseason through free agency and the draft if they want to have a better season in 2020, bounce back into the playoffs in 2020, and have a winning season in 2020 and going into the future. This season, Courtland Sutton had 72 receptions for 1,112 yards and 6 touchdowns. Broncos rookie tight end Noah Fant set franchise records for receptions and yards by rookie tight end, which included his 40 receptions, 562 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Drew Lock is tied with John Elway for the most wins by a rookie quarterback in Broncos franchise history. Ford 1 is the second most wins in franchise history by a quarterback in December. The Broncos' 41.5% was the NFL's best red zone defense this season, and it was also the Broncos' best red zone defense since at least 1995. Justin Simmons was named second-team All-Pro safety. Von Miller moved into 26 and all-time sacks. Bill Belichick, John Harbaugh, and Mike McCarthy are the 3 head coaches to have the most playoff wins by a head coach since 2006. Saints quarterback Taysom Hill is the first player in NFL history to have 50-plus passing yards, 50-plus rushing yards, and 25-plus receiving yards in a playoff game. Derrick Henry now has the Titans franchise playoff record in rushing yards. DK Metcalf now holds the record for the most receiving yards by a rookie in a playoff game in NFL history after he had 7 catches for 160 yards and 1 touchdown during the Seahawks-Eagles game in the Wild Card weekend. The Titans snapped the Patriots' 8-season AFC Championship appearance streak after beating the Patriots 20-13 in the Wild Card weekend. The Patriots lost to the Titans is their first wild card loss since 2009. Tom Brady has now failed to throw a passing touchdown in each of his last 2 playoff games. The last time he did that was back in 2001 during his very first 2 playoff games. Tom Brady entered the 2019 playoffs as a postseason's all-time leader in games played, passing yards, and touchdown passes. This week is the NFL divisional weekend. So right now, I'm going to update you with the NFL wildcard weekend final scores. I'm also going to tell you the NFL divisional weekend schedule. So if we take a look at the NFL wildcard weekend, the Texans beat the Bills 22-19. The Titans beat the Patriots 20-13. The Vikings beat the Saints 26-20. And the Seahawks beat the Eagles 17-9. Now taking a look at the Texans-Bills game, the Bills almost had the opportunity of going down to Houston and upsetting the Texans, since the Texans don't have a great home playoff record down in Houston. But this game went into overtime, and the Texans were able to hold on and beat the Bills in this game. Now taking a look at the Titans-Patriots game, like I said last week, I definitely saw some upsets happening in the wild card weekend, and this was definitely one of the upsets in the wild card weekend. The Titans were able to beat the Patriots up in New England at Gillette Stadium, and there's no doubt that the Titans upset the Patriots in this game during wild card weekend. After the type of playoff game that Tom Brady and the Patriots had, and the type of season that Tom Brady and the Patriots had in 2019, we're going to have to wait and see what the Patriots roster looks like in 2020. Was the wild card weekend the last game we ever saw Tom Brady play in the Patriots uniform and at Gillette Stadium. We're going to have to wait and see. Tom Brady's contract expired at the end of this season. If Tom Brady wants to continue playing, it can be with the Patriots in 2020, or it could possibly be on a different NFL team. We're going to have to wait and see what Tom Brady and the Patriots decide to do this offseason. But there was a chance that this Titans-Patriots game during the NFL wildcard weekend was the last game Tom Brady ever played in a Patriots uniform or in the NFL. So we're going to have to wait and see what the Patriots do with Tom Brady this offseason. Taking a look at the Vikings-Saints game, this was another upset. The Saints play their best football down in New Orleans. And the Vikings were able to go down to New Orleans and upset the Saints right at the end of the game. So it's unfortunate that the Saints got eliminated by the Vikings in the wild card weekend after the type of season that Drew Brees had and the type of record-breaking season that Michael Thomas had. The Saints will not have a chance at reaching and winning the Super Bowl again this season. Taking a look at the Seahawks-Eagles game, the Seahawks were able to go to Philadelphia and beat the Eagles. Wasn't surprised that the Seahawks beat the Eagles in this game. This week is the NFL divisional weekend. The Vikings go against the 49ers, the Titans go against the Ravens, the Texans go against the Chiefs, and the Seahawks go against the Packers. Now taking a look at the NFL divisional weekend, the 49ers have a great chance at beating the Vikings up in Northern California. It's very likely that the 49ers will win this game since they have home field advantage throughout the playoffs in the NFC. So my prediction is that the 49ers will beat the Vikings. Taking a look at the Titans-Ravens game, my prediction is that the Ravens will win this game. They have home field advantage throughout the playoffs in the AFC. The Ravens have been one of the best teams in the AFC and in the NFL this season, especially with quarterback Lamar Jackson. So there's no reason why the Ravens wouldn't beat the Titans in Baltimore. Taking a look at the Texans-Chiefs game, this will definitely be a great game. We could see an upset here. We could see the Texans beat the Chiefs, but with the Chiefs having home field advantage in this game and playing in Kansas City, my prediction is the Chiefs will win this game. Taking a look at the Seahawks-Packers games, this game has always been a great game, whether it's in Green Bay or in Seattle. So this game may come down all the way to the end. It should be another great matchup between the Seahawks and the Packers. With the Packers having home field advantage, my prediction is that the Packers will win this game. But if the Seahawks or the Packers win this game, it will be a close game. But in the divisional weekend, I do see all the home teams winning their games, since all the home teams are great football teams and they have home field advantage. So that's the NFL Wildcard Weekend final scores and the NFL Divisional Weekend schedule for the NFL. Right now I'm going to take a commercial break. When I come back, I will talk about the NBA and NHL. Welcome back to All Sports with Gerardo. Moving on now to NBA basketball. Vince Carter is the first player in NBA history to play in 4 decades, which includes the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, and 2020s. Rajon Rondo moved into 17th in all-time assists. LeBron James moved into 13th in all-time steals. James Harden moved into 8th in all-time triple-doubles. Trae Young and James Harden had the first pair of 40-point triple-doubles in NBA history. The Hawks-Rockets game was the first game in NBA history with 2 players recording 40-point triple-doubles. James Harden moved into 8th to become the 8th player in NBA history to have 2,200 plus career three-pointers made. Russell Westbrook joins LeBron James and Oscar Robertson as the only players with 19,000 points, 6,000 rebounds, and 7,000 assists. During his career, Dwight Howard has 13,000 rebounds, 2,000 blocks, and 1,000 steals. Carmelo Anthony, Kobe Bryant, and LeBron James have the most game-winning shots since 2003-2004. In the last 20 seasons, Carmelo Anthony and Kobe Bryant had the most go-ahead field goals in the final 5 seconds of the fourth quarter or in overtime. Anthony Davis has declined a 4-year contract extension offer from the Lakers, and he is expected to hit the free agency market this summer. Victor Oladipo will make his season debut on January 29th against the Bills. The Heat are going to retire Dwayne Wade's jersey on February 22nd. So right now I'm going to update you with the current schedule for the Nuggets. I'm going to tell you every team the Nuggets went up against this past week and the final scores of those games. And I'm also going to tell you who the Nuggets go against in the next week. To start off, the Nuggets went against the Pacers, and the Nuggets beat the Pacers 124-116. The Nuggets went against the Wizards, and the Nuggets lost to the Wizards 128-114. The Nuggets went against the Hawks, and the Nuggets beat the Hawks 123-115. And the Nuggets went against the Mavericks, and the Nuggets won a close game against the Mavericks by 1 point, 107-106. This week, the Nuggets go against the Cavaliers, the Clippers, and the Hornets. So that's the current schedule for the Nuggets, for the teams they went up against this past week and the final scores of those games, and also who the Nuggets go against in the next week. In the Week 12 NBA Power Rankings, the current top 10 NBA basketball teams are the Bucks, Lakers, Celtics, Clippers, Heat, Rockets, Raptors, Nuggets, Jazz, and Mavericks. Moving on now to NHL hockey, the 2020 NHL Stadium Series will be at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs on Saturday, February 15th, between the Avalanche and the Kings. So right now I'm going to update you with the current schedule for the Avalanche. I'm going to tell you every team the Avalanche went up against this past week and the final scores of those games, and also who the Avalanche go up against in the next week. To start off, the Avalanche went against the Blues, and the Avalanche beat the Blues 7-3. The Avalanche went against the Devils, and the Avalanche beat the Devils 5-2. The Avalanche went against the Islanders, and the Avalanche lost a close game to the Islanders 1-0. And the Avalanche went against the Rangers, and the Avalanche lost to the Rangers 5-3. This week, the Avalanche go against the Penguins and the Stars. So that's the current schedule for the Avalanche, for the teams they went up against this past week and the final scores of those games, and also who the Avalanche go up against in the next week. Right now I'm going to take a commercial break. When I come back, I will talk about college football and college basketball. Welcome back to All Sports with Gerardo. Moving on now to college football. The 2020 College Football Playoff National Championship game will be between number 1 LSU and number 3 Clemson on Monday, January 13th in New Orleans. So taking a look at the College Football Playoff National Championship game between number 1 LSU and number 3 Clemson, this will be a great national championship game between LSU and Clemson, and we're going to have to wait and see who wins this game. This is the battle between the Tigers down in New Orleans in Louisiana. This will definitely be a great national championship game between LSU and Clemson, and we're going to have to wait and see who wins this game. LSU is definitely favored to win this game, after the type of season they've had, especially with quarterback Joe Burrow, but don't underestimate Clemson with quarterback Trevor Lawrence, because Clemson had another great season this season in college football, just like they've had in the last few seasons with Trevor Lawrence at the quarterback position. So don't underestimate Clemson, even though they are the underdog in the national championship game. But this will definitely be a great national championship game between LSU and Clemson, and we're going to have to wait and see who wins this game. DeAndre Swift has declared for the 2020 NFL Draft. Henry Hooks III has declared for the 2020 NFL Draft. Jerry Jude has declared for the 2020 NFL Draft. Jake Flume has declared for the 2020 NFL Draft. Jonathan Taylor has declared for the 2020 NFL Draft. J.K. Dobbins has declared for the 2020 NFL Draft. Chase Young has declared for the 2020 NFL Draft. Tua Tagovailoa has declared for the 2020 NFL Draft. Moving on now to college basketball. In the college basketball AP Top 10 poll, the current top 10 college basketball teams are Gonzaga, Ohio State, Louisville, Duke, Kansas, Oregon, Baylor, Auburn, Memphis, and Villanova. Right now I'm going to take a commercial break. When I come back, I will talk about the end of the show. Welcome back to All Sports with Gerardo. Moving on now to end the show. What to watch for this week in sports. The Vikings versus the 49ers. The Titans versus the Ravens. The Texans versus the Chiefs. The Seahawks versus the Packers. NFL Divisional Weekend. NFL Playoffs. NFL Football. The 2020 College Football Playoff National Championship game between number 1 LSU and number 3 Clemson on Monday, January 13th in New Orleans. College football, college basketball, the Nuggets, NBA basketball, the Avalanche, NHL hockey. Moving on now, on the next show, I will talk about NFL football, Major League Baseball, NBA basketball, NHL hockey, college football, and college basketball. I hope y'all have a great weekend. Tune in to the next All Sports with Gerardo show next Thursday. I want to say thank you to everybody that listens to All Sports through Met Radio here on mymetmedia.com. Subscribe or like my pages on social media at All Sports with Gerardo. Until next time, this is Gerardo.